Work it, make it, do it, make sense. Harder, better, faster, stronger. Work it harder, make it better, do it faster, make sense, stronger. More than ever.
Thank you to all of our patrons who are helping us support communities in need. If you'd like to help too, please visit our Patreon page at the link above.
So, we thought we'd do something a little bit different for this week's episode. It's kind of fun. We own a steel boat, and I see repeatedly in comments forums and comments on our videos where people are curious about the benefits of steel, the pros and the cons. And we've been living aboard our boat for a year now, and it's very recently that we went through the whole boat purchasing process and asked a lot of the questions that people who right now are considering buying a boat ask. So we thought it would be a really opportune time to sort of chip in our 2 cents on the conversation of if you're thinking of buying a boat and you're wondering, should we look at steel boats, should we be looking at glass boats? Maybe this conversation will help clarify in your mind what might be the better option for you. And we're just going to stick to steel and fiberglass. I thought maybe about talking about aluminum, but what I know from being quite involved with fiberglass production and composites from building surfboards, I know quite a bit about glass. And I mean, I didn't build boats, I repaired boats, though. I worked in a boatyard for a summer doing glass work because I was very good at glassing from surfboards. So it was easy for me to get work at a boatyard where, you know, not a lot of people like to grind fiberglass and breathe in toxic chemicals. So it was like, yeah, you're hired, bro. I can speak to glass and we can speak to steel because we've now owned a steel boat for a year. So we're going to talk about the pros and cons of steel versus glass. So the first subject naturally is going to be the discussion of strength. So this is a bit of a convoluted subject. Steel is universally known as a very, very strong material, but fiberglass is pound for pound arguably stronger. So we're going to try and break down the nuanced topic of strength, glass versus steel. No, this is better than that. It's always a discussion of compromise, right? So every boat is a compromise. It'll do some things better than others, and that's true of glass versus steel. But when it comes to strength, here's what we can tell you from a fairly certain position on the information. So
steel wins right away in strength. There's just no debate about that. The math is, you can talk about the yield, how much of material is going to bend under a force of strain, and then how much force that actually takes for that material to break. So when we talk about ultimate breaking strength, steel's going to win. Fiberglass is pretty strong, but it's not going to beat steel. Steel will bend, show deformity before fiberglass. The fiberglass, there's different types of fiberglass. We're talking about
your typical layup of like roving and matte, and like a solid glass hull. We're not even gonna get into cord hulls, but take your typical 70s, 80s, 3/4 inch thick solid glass hull. That's the comparison we're typically talking about,
right? Because
we're talking about offshore boats, namely, right?
Yeah, so the strength of steel is that, it's got a lower yield when it comes to showing deformity. It will show deformity before a composite fiberglass, but it will break way later than a fiberglass boat. So you won't see deformity as much on a fiberglass boat, but its breaking strength it'll just happen. It'll just crack.
Yeah, as the pressure increases on a point, the force acting on fiberglass is localized, so it won't it won't bend, it won't distribute the force over that whole area of the boat. It's going to be force on that point, and what happens is with the fiberglass boat, it's going to hold, and then probably hole. You'll create an actual puncture in the boat or cracks locally in that area. Whereas what happens with steel is that it's almost certainly, and it did in this case with this vessel, as we learned through our hull history on this boat, is that in this case it did actually, the weight of the boat did actually put some small area of dents on the spot where it was sitting on the reef and rocking on the rocks, right? And okay, it was dented, but it floated off. They hauled it, looked at it, some scratches and dents, put it back in the water, and you're good to go, right? It addresses the strength subject with steel, and was definitely a big contributing factor to why we bought this vessel, especially being our first boat together, and the boat that we wanted to go offshore with. There was a high degree of comfort in knowing that we could potentially, and as it's been demonstrated unfortunately with this boat, you could actually put it high and dry or run a reef or something, and the reef's probably going to be worse to wear than the boat is itself. So
this is the kind of boat you buy if you think about going somewhere where there's ice that you're going to run into, or unforeseeables in the water. Like if you're going to do offshoring, you want something that you're not going to be freaked out about if you tap something out there. That's what I wanted to do when we boat shopped. I wanted something that I could feel confident in, that if we bumped something, it wasn't initial panic because we probably have a hole.
Construction. So I'll go through the differences in construction between fiberglass and steel boats. So the first thing we'll talk about is the general form of the hull, right? So one of the big advantages with a fiberglass manufactured boat is that they are created out of a form, and that form, creating that form, we'll get back to that in a minute, but you have virtually unlimited options for the hull shape itself when you're creating a mold for a fiberglass boat, which gives you a lot of options for the design that you want. And when you're working with a naval architect, you can have really nice, beautiful round chines and really nice raked aft section of the boat, and all kinds of very elaborate compound curves into how it comes up into the hull or into the bow of the boat, and so on and so forth. And that becomes quite a bit more challenging when you're building a steel boat. Basically, you're limited to two steel boat construction methods. Either you're using plate steel or you're using rolled steel. So if you have a boat like ours, which is a rounded chine steel boat, then that's a little bit even more involved construction process than a hard chine steel boat, because the steel itself has to be curved to an appropriate curvature to get that shape, right? So you will see most steel boats, more and more modern ones are round chines, but you'll see most steel boats are hard chine because it's easier construction method to take plate steel, cut it to the size of that area, and weld that plate on there, right? So you'll see a lot more variety in glass boats, so that's something to consider when you're boat shopping. Another really important discussion that comes up a lot when people are considering buying a boat is whether it's an integral keel or a bolt-on keel.
Right.
That conversation is a non-issue with a steel boat. It's welded on. I mean, you don't get any more integral than that. It's welded on, and you could essentially, in most instances, put the whole weight of the boat on the keel. So you could actually you could careen a steel hulled boat, and you're not going to be concerned about the weight of the boat resting on the keel, because the keel is welded on, and all, as we discussed, all the weight of the keel is distributed throughout the weight, or throughout the strength of the plating of the boat itself. And same with groundings. So if you were to accidentally I don't think most people aren't going to purposely ground, but if you were to accidentally ground your boat and it's on its side and the tide's going in and out, or beaches on and there's surf and it's rocking on the keel, a steel boat's going to handle that situation a lot longer and better than a glass boat will. So a lot of more modern production glass boats have various forms of bolt-on keels, and depending on the maintenance regimen for those boats, those bolts on those keel bolts can be quite suspect, badly rusted out, or even look great, but where you can't see them, they are badly corroded. And now all that's really structurally holding that keel on is the outer skins, the outer glass layers. Basically, the integrity of that keel is the bolts on a glass boat, and that's something, if you're buying a boat, you want to be very aware of and look very closely at, other than keel hull designed glass boats where the keel is integral. So like a full keel, example, like an older Bill Garden design or something like that, like a Force 50 or something with a big old full keel. You could careen a boat like that and not have to worry about it. So anyway, it's just something to consider in the debate, steel versus glass boat. But there's a couple really important things to consider when it comes to rigging glass boat versus a steel boat. So there's deck stepped, there's keel stepped. That applies to both steel and glass boats. In the case of our boat, we have a deck stepped mast with a compression post, and the compression post comes through the cabin and sits on top of a beam that runs, and the beam doesn't even go right down to the keel. Actually, the beam is strong enough on its own that the compression post sits on top of that beam, and the beam absorbs all the weight of that, or force of the rig. And you would be very concerned if you saw any kind of compression in the deck. You're not likely to see that problem on a steel boat, whether it's a deck stepped or a keel stepped. All the weight of that rig is very, very well supported because of the strength of the steel boat construction itself. So that's one aspect to consider. There's a lot of advantages to having basically the strength of a keel stepped rig with the ease of a deck stepped mast for dropping your rig. So it's a lot more elaborate process to remove a keel stepped mast, because it's got to be lifted very carefully out from inside of your boat. So it's got to come, you got to disconnect it from its base and very carefully raise it up, while make sure all your electronics are disconnected, and carefully up through the deck of your boat. And that involves cranes and so on and so forth, where you can get creative with a buddy boat and drop a deck stepped rig without a crane. You're probably still going to want a crane, but
you drop the mast to do maintenance or to travel it back to a new place?
Yeah, either or. So usually you're dropping the mast, if you're going to trailer your boat home for the winter, right? So a lot of people in the Great Lakes, for example, will on a small enough boat, drop the rig, put it on a trailer and haul it home and put it in your yard, so you're not paying for yard fees all winter long, right?
That better be a small boat then.
Yeah, well, that's what I mean. It's usually 30 foot or smaller, right? The bigger boats, it becomes less feasible to do that, and they're usually going to be left, they're going to be hauled out and kept at a boatyard under a tarp, right? If you're 30 foot or up, usually, depending on how much property you have, I guess, and how many power lines between the marina and your house and all that stuff.
Just seems like if you have a boat that's greater than 35 feet with a deep keel, I don't see how trailering can be very feasible.
No, exactly.
Or cheap.
No, exactly. The other reasons you would drop a mast is, as Morgan said, for maintenance. So if you got to do, if you have to do wiring, if you have an issue with your antenna, VHF antenna, your wind indicator's messed up and you can't fix it from just going up, you got to bring it down. If you're repainting it, for example, any of those kind of things, you have to drop it because the welds around your spreaders have fatigued and failed, or whatever the case is. Drop it, re-weld them on, whatever. So when you're shopping for a glass boat, some of the things you definitely want to look for are any kind of sagging in the deck around the mast step itself.
Ugh.
Yeah, and that's actually quite common in truth. If you're shopping and looking at glass boats, you're gonna, in a lot of cases, see a little bit of an indentation around there, but you want to make sure that there's no water ingress in there. The indentation itself is not necessarily...
But osmosis would be.
Yeah, any kind of water ingress around that's going to weaken the coring around the deck there, and that's going to become a bigger structural issue that will have to be addressed. Again, it's not a deal breaker. You drop the rig, cut out any rot that's in there, re-glass it, re-core it, all that stuff. Make sure your compression post is good and all that kind of thing. But again, the compression post is coming down and sitting onto the floors of the boat, and I don't mean cabin sole. I mean the floors, the actual areas of reinforcement that run around the shape of the hull and give the hull its structural support. So again, with glass boats, you want to look for any rot in the floors around the base of your compression post, because if there's any water ingress from your bilge that has rotted any of the floors. Other things specific to rigging is deck attachments. So when you're buying a fiberglass boat, you definitely want to very carefully, and if you have a surveyor, they're going to carefully inspect if they can, and that's the thing, sometimes you can't even get to them, but the chain plates that your shroud's attached to. So in a lot of cases on glass boats, there's issues with even accessing where the chain plates are to inspect them, because the chain plates are usually a stainless steel in most cases, plate that comes through and it's bolted through. So you have a plate on one side of a bulkhead and a plate on the other side of the bulkhead. I'll put a picture in here, and the bolts are threaded through, and if there's any crevice corrosion there at all, or any corrosion at all that could fatigue the bolts or weaken the strength of that steel plate there, then you're going to have a weak point where the force of the shrouds, which is holding the force of the wind against the mast, can either pop the chain plate apart, rip it apart, and come ripping through your deck, causing all kinds of damage, or worse. One of the big advantages that I didn't even really consider when we bought the boat, but it immediately kind of became apparent to us, was that, you know, oh yeah, we don't ever have to worry about inspecting chain plates. Our
boat is a chain plate.
Our boat is a chain plate. So there's a reason chain plates are steel. Yeah. Because the maximum load bearing capacity of this material is the greatest out there. That's right. Exactly. Well, it beats fiberglass anyway. Yeah. So yeah, I think that's the thing, right? Like for load bearing capacity, steel wins. Yeah. Again. Another thing when you're boat shopping, you do want to check around your chain plates and see if there's any lifting. So it's the opposite of the compression issue with a mast. You want to look for lifting, deck lifting, you know, backstay or forestay attachment points. You want to definitely check around there that they're not lifting up on the deck. Again, that there hasn't been any water ingress around those points. And well, around anything deck attachment wise, when you're shopping for glass boats, you want to look around the windlass, for example, or anywhere else there's any attachment through deck attachment. That's a big advantage of steel, is that unless they're so badly rusted away to almost nothing, then they're still going to maintain that strength. And we'll talk about corrosion in a minute as well, but insofar as corrosion in terms of like an attachment point like that, you could literally have that piece of steel 50% wasted away, and it's still going to be almost 100% of its strength. So a lot of people don't realize that, and rust is a big concern considering a steel boat. But you can literally have it almost 50% wasted away, and you're still going to have like 80% of its strength, or something to that effect. Those aren't exact numbers, but it's something like that. You can reduce your material considerably without a massive loss of strength. Things like through hulls. So on a glass boat, you have you have the issue of sometimes unlike materials. So you have a hole through your fiberglass boat, and then you're putting, say, a copper through hull, attaching it to fiberglass, or a composite through hull, and sandwiching that. So you have a collar on the outside of the hull, and a piece that comes through the hull, and then a collar or a plate on the inside with a collar that sits on top of that plate, which in a lot of cases is like a wood, you know, square that has been fiberglassed or painted over, and you're using epoxies and 5200 and different sealants on the threading and that. So a lot of people are probably very familiar with what I'm talking about with through hulls on glass boats, right? So that's a lot of disc-like materials, and they're very, very strong. But when you consider all those disc-like materials, there's certain drawbacks to that versus a steel boat where it's a steel hull with a steel spigot welded on there that's got a thread on it, and then you thread your brass or bronze, not brass, bronze. Or a composite. We have a couple through hulls that are like a heavy-duty composite material, but it literally threads on to the steel spigot, if that's even the right term, right? And that's it, right? So the actual through hull, through the hull itself, is as strong as the hull, right?
And welded there in place.
It's welded in place, and the strength of a weld is equal to the strength of the steel. Some of the issues, again, that you'd have with through hulls on glass boats is water ingress through the materials, where you have osmosis happening if there isn't a perfect seal. And even with a perfect seal, it's just a reality of glass, is that there's always this chemical process where osmosis is taking place, where water is trying to migrate in, and any impurities in the glass are trying to work its way out. So any acids that are trapped within the layers of glass due to any kind of contamination, or if there's a void of air in that glass anywhere, then chemical acids within the resins themselves are going to try and get to those voids. Water's going to try and come in, and all that process happens over time almost regardless, right?
Ugh.
Water is very, very good. It's a very, very small, you know, on like a level, I guess, like on the molecular level, water molecules are very, very small, and they're very, very good at getting into voids. So so that's something. So you have issues with, again, flexing of glass around those fittings, water ingress around those fittings, which doesn't happen with steel unless the steel's so badly corroded, and that's a whole other problem, right? So the integrity of your through hulls are a little more suspect, in my opinion, and I'd say that's probably fairly scientifically valid as well, that the integrity of a steel boat through hull is far greater than that of a glass boat through hull. I'm sure there's going to be haters that completely disagree with that statement, but I don't give a shit, man. Science.
Science, bitches.
Still on the construction subheading, I guess you could call it, engine mounts. So this was another one that I loved with the steel boat, because we've had to motor for like fucking, I don't know, 12 hours through brutal pounding head-on wave and wind conditions with this boat since we've had it, and popping the engine hatch and looking at it while the whole engine's like kind of moving around, and it's flexing on because it's on rubber mounts, right? Like your engine is mounted, so it's designed to handle some flex and some movement. But I mean, comfort that I did take in that scenario is I'm looking at the steel beams that the bloody engine's bolted to, and as long as those engine bolts are in good shape, and the mounts themselves, like the rubber bushings, aren't too badly worn or anything like that, I could look at that and I'm like, okay, she's bouncing around really good, but it's not gonna rip the bolts through the where they're mounted to. Versus, again, if you're looking at buying a glass boat, you want to really have a careful look at the condition of your engine mounts. And again, it's kind of the same problem as keel bolts, where the bolts will go in and they might look great from the top, but where they sit through fiberglass and sometimes into wood coring as well, the metal is encased, and any moisture that is inherent in the wood is slowly corroding that. You're so mature.
How could you tell? That's what I was thinking.
Slowly corroding the leg bolt, and and it's slowly corroding the leg bolt. Oh my god.
Sorry, what were we talking about?
And if it's not the bolt itself that is corroded and is now at risk of shearing off, the other issue is that any of that movement, like I just described, will actually fatigue the.
You're doing that on purpose.
It'll actually fatigue the hole itself that the bolt is threaded into. So often, a lot of people with older glass boats will have to fill and re-drill those leg bolts attachments, so your engine doesn't just fly off while you're out pounding through waves.
Yeah, that would be bad.
Yeah, so something to consider.
Not having your engine fly off.
So again, I guess talking sort of about like materials, shaft struts. The shaft strut that comes down off the bottom of your boat and holds the shaft furthest away from the stern tube, and stern tubes for that matter. The stern tube itself is going to be glass on a glass boat in most cases, and if there's any extreme movement in the shaft itself, can damage the stern tube, and now you have a very, very difficult problem if that starts leaking and you're not close to shore. It's an awkward hole. You can't just stick a bung in there. You've got a real problem. You're probably packing it with towels and stuff, and you can't necessarily operate either. So that's a particular area of concern with a glass boat that you want to very carefully address with a surveyor or through your own inspection. And as a point of maintenance, is to make sure that area is structurally sound. And with the shaft strut itself, in a lot of cases, it's a steel material that is, again, bolted or fixed onto the bottom of a glass boat and holding that the shaft from moving laterally or vertically. It holds it. It holds it so it's not moving. And if there is any movement, say you whack into something, or you get like you get a fishing net or something wrapped around it, or if there's any other odd forces exerted on that shaft, you are pushing a steel strut against a glass hull, and you're gonna have the weakest point in that chain is going to be the glass that the strut is connected to. That's going to fail. So you're going to get cracks or issues where the bolts bolt into the glass that hold the strut in place. I've seen on glass boats where the strut's quite badly bent, and in that case you definitely need to pull the shaft, bend the strut back if you can, and then very carefully, or replace the strut, and then very carefully inspect that connection to the hull. So whereas with a steel boat, even if you bent the strut somehow, its connection point to the boat is going to be a lot less suspect, where you're probably going to be able to heat and bend that shaft strut straight again, or cut it off and weld on a new one, right? So insulation we talked about quite a bit in some of our other videos, but one of the natural advantages of a glass boat, I guess you could put it, is that they don't necessitate a lot of insulation, or any insulation really, for construction purposes. The inherent qualities of fiberglass, like it's a natural insulator anyway, right? So there is a little bit of insulation that is put into glass boats to curtail the issue of condensation, but the difference with steel construction is that steel boats are usually quite heavily insulated because condensation becomes a structural issue with steel, where if the hull isn't very well insulated, the condensation will come down and sit on the steel stringers and create corrosion issues. So that's why when steel boats right out of the boatyard are in most instances hitting the water and they're already very, very well insulated with 2-inch polystyrene foam or spray foam sprayed in every void from the waterline up, and that is a structural issue for the integrity of the steel to curtail corrosion issues. So although it's not necessary for structural or construction purposes in a glass boat to have that degree of insulation, the disadvantage is that glass boats are, in most cases, and due to costs and mass construction, are quite under insulated. And therefore, if you're cruising in the high northern or southern latitudes, in most cases, a steel boat is going to be immediately more comfortable out of the box, so to speak, unless you were to do quite a bit of retrofitting in a glass boat to improve the insulation of it. So you'll see a lot of folks who are intending to cruise the high northern or southern latitudes will typically prefer a steel boat, not only because it's stronger for impact resistance if you bump into ice or other stuff, or like a container, a sea can that's fallen off a container ship or something like that. It's also going to be quite a bit more comfortable because it's very well insulated. Steel boats are very well insulated for those reasons, and are therefore typically easier to heat and typically easier to cool too, which that might be debatable, but I've read quite a bit where people suggest that because their steel boats well insulated, that they can keep them reasonably well conditioned, air conditioned or cooled, versus glass boats in the nearer the equator. So those are some of the advantages related to insulation and the reasons for the construction of that.
Sorry.
Last point of construction, and I hope people that are watching this will join in the comments, because I know we will have definitely missed a number of things that we didn't consider or have forgotten to talk about. But last point of construction considerations is that with glass boats, in a lot of cases, due to the construction methods, the interior design is very integral part of the overall design. So a lot of cases, the construction of a glass boat involves forming a hull, forming the deck separately, attaching the deck and the hull, and what goes between the deck and the hull is the interior furniture template, I guess you could say, right? So more modern production boats, a lot of the furniture is actually molded fiberglass parts. So you'll see a lot of fiberglass cabinets and seats and settees and that kind of stuff, and then the cushions and any wood finishing are attached to that later. But basically you have the hull, you have the interior insert that is inserted into the hull and tabbed, glassed and tabbed, which then the deck is attached to, and that forms the structural integrity of the boat. So the interior furniture helps stiffen up the boat and alleviate some of those issues with the boat's torsional flexing and so forth. So even with some of the more expensive custom production boats, there are still going to be certain limitations in terms of where certain bulkheads must be, and there's going to be a lot less leeway in talking to your architect about can we move that head further forward and put this here and so on. That may not be an option in terms of ordering a custom production glass boat, And in mass-produced boats, you're usually going to be limited to, in most cases, 2 interior layout plans. Very rarely are you going to see 3 different interior layout plans. It's not very cost-effective when you're looking at the cost of production. So one of the distinct advantages and why there's a lot of custom and home-built steel boats is that the integrity of the hull is the integrity of the boat. So the construction of the boat has steel stringers running all through the hull of the boat, and steel bulkheads running through the bilge, and that's basically the strength of the boat. There's not really the same necessity for the cabinetry to form bulkheads and strengthen up the boat itself. You could basically move your interior cabinetry wherever you want. So you'll see a lot of really cool variation in steel boat interior layouts for that reason. There's a lot more opportunity for the architect or the builder, the designer, to kind of let their imagination run and figure out where they want to put stuff, and without there being critical concerns for the integrity of the boat itself, the strength of the hull. So just something worth mentioning, I feel. Safety, other than the obvious strength benefits and offshoring and bumping into things, steel boats, in the God forbid instance of a fire, fare much better. So even a fire that you contain within the engine room itself. So in our boat, we have, this is all behind the engine room is a solid steel firewall. So our aft cabin is completely sealed off from the engine room. If the engine room were to catch on fire, it would not travel back towards where we are until it engulfed the entire cabinet. We could easily get out through the hatch in the back long before the fire became that
Out of control.
And in a lot of cases, you will be able to put out a fire in a steel boat if you happen to be on board and get it soon enough. You could put the fire out. With a glass boat, motorboat, sailboat, doesn't matter. In a lot of cases, in a fire, the fiberglass and resins are petrochemicals, and they love to burn. They are quite resistant to a point, but once they ignite, they're extraordinarily flammable. And you'll have probably read or heard or seen photos where a lot of boats will burn down literally to the water line.
Ew.
Until the water itself is no longer flammable. And whatever's left of the hull may actually still be floating there like a little bathtub.
That's horrible.
Yeah, it's happened, and I've seen a number of photos where you'll just see, I've never seen it in person, but yeah, I've seen photos where there's just the bottom of the boat sitting there floating, if it hasn't sank altogether. So
awful.
So yeah, there's in fact, I think one of the boats we went to look at, the steel boat, the first one we looked at, the red one, had a engine room fire that they were able to contain, control, and repair whatever was done. And you looked at the boat and you would have never known there was a fire, and it's not even an issue, right? So we didn't buy that boat though.
Yeah.
Sounds like bad luck, but electrical strikes. So this one, I'm hoping we'll get a lot of anecdotal discussion in the comment sections about this from those who have experienced lightning strikes. We have not, knock on wood, and all throughout my youth and sailing experience, I've never experienced that. But from what I've heard, there are far less issues with a electrical strike with a steel boat. Steel is obviously quite conductive, which has other issues which we'll talk about in a moment. But the conductivity in terms of a lightning strike, the lightning will very easily find a path to ground out into the water, right? And the more direct route that the hey sweetie, is that a good dinner? The more direct route that the electricity can travel from that electric or the from the
Dog break.
from the lightning strike to a point of exit, the better off your boat will fare, and the less electrical equipment it's going to take out on the way. So if the lightning were to hit the mast itself is conductive. The shrouds are conductive, so if the path of electricity came down the mast, it could come through some of your electronics and run down through those wires and bounce around and find a way out, which happens often on glass boats or any boats. It could run down a shroud and find a way out. But with a steel boat, it's going to run down a shroud, say, get to the hull, and it's going to quickly find a direct route to ground, right? If it hits the mast, it's going to come through, and say it traveled all the way through our compression posts and hits the beam at the bottom. It's steel. It's going to find a route out pretty quickly. With a glass boat, electricity can have all kinds of weird effects.
It'll go through your electronics first.
It'll travel through the mast, and it's going to hit if it's a stepped mast, deck stepped, for example, it's going to hit that mast step, which sits into an insulator, which is fiberglass, and the electricity is going to want to find a way beyond that point. So it's usually going to run through. A lot of people will ground their mast and try and ground it to, say, the engine block or something, right? But you have to ground out your mast on a glass boat, so that electricity is going to have to travel through a wire and try and go out to ground somewhere. But no matter what, going out to ground means going at some point exiting through a glass hull, right? Or if it will travel nicely from your mast all the way to your engine block and out your prop shaft or something like that with doing minimal collateral damage, it's still a long way and a very indirect path for that electricity to travel. And in a lot of cases, it's going to hit your mast. It's going to find a route through your electronics and out that way. And I've seen, again, I've never seen it in person, but I've seen a number of images of electrical strikes, electricity strikes on glass boats where the energy will exit through the hull, through, say, a near or around a through hull, and what it does is it will almost shatter like glass. The electricity will spiral out like a spider web and perforate the glass hull with like a million pinpricks and basically create like this weird area of like a sponge where it's just a million little tiny pinpricks, where all of a sudden, some cases glass boats are hit by electricity and they start leaking, and you can't even pinpoint, pardon the pun, where the leak is coming from, because the electricity will go through all kinds of crazy paths to ground out, and it will have weird effects on the physical properties of fiberglass. I'm curious, for any of you who have been so misfortunate or unfortunate, I would love to hear your comments about your experience with being hit by lightning in a glass boat or a steel boat, and it'd be interesting to just get a bit of an anecdotal list going to see the pros and cons of being hit by lightning.
Or and how it traveled.
Yeah, or what it did. I've heard a lot of people, and if they're concerned about electrical storms, will put all of their electronics into their stove, because the stove itself...
I've heard that.
Yeah, because it's, the stove itself, if the electricity for whatever reason were to come near the stove, it's going to travel through the exterior of the stove. It's not going to bounce around and take out all your electronics that are sitting up in the middle of your stove, right? So, and I remember hearing that even when we, lived... when we were landlubbers. Same thing, if you're concerned about electrical storm, a lot of people would put their laptops or whatever
in the oven.
I think we discussed it briefly. We'll touch on it though. Weight, obviously, there's pros and cons to the significant weight increase of a steel boat. In our minds, in purchasing this vessel, it was a pro for us because for the size of this boat, pound for pound, compared to an equivalent sized glass boat, this boat is considerably heavier and therefore considerably more stable in heavy wind conditions. We won't have the light air performance advantages of a similar sized lighter glass boat. However, we can put up as much sail as we can possibly send up the pole and still get pretty good light air performance. And when it's most important in my mind, when you get surprised and you're out at sea and it's 35, 40 knots, you could have the time to react in those situations without a knockdown situation where you can reduce your sail area, reef your sails, drop your sails altogether, whatever the case is, and you're a lot less corky feeling. I went out on a neighbor's boat here just to help him bring it around, and guys, let's take these on the table there. And he has a 45-foot Bavaria, and it's a gorgeous boat. Double wheels, double rudders, and very, very nimble boat. It'll do a complete 360 within its own wake, and very maneuverable, very fast sailboat. But even in a relatively small sea state, 3-4 foot swell, that boat was rocking around quite aggressively, whereas in those same sea state conditions, our boat barely moves, right? So there's a lot of advantages and disadvantages to a large, heavy boat. Morgan alluded to it earlier, where you do
you slow down, right? I mean, like, we're not going to win any races against a comparable fiberglass boat just because of our weight, right? But that wasn't the point for us, so we didn't really consider it a con, even though most people would consider heavy boat a con. So
apples to apples, feeling a little underpowered compared to a glass boat with the equivalent size power plant. Just considerations with hauling out. You need to make sure that if you're hauling out, you're going to a facility that has a large enough crane or a travel lift that can deal with it.
They'll ask you about the weight, and it may be a factor in cost, so something to consider.
When you're tied to a dock, it's no different, but and that's not even true. When you're tied to a dock, same thing. If there's any kind of chop or wind or whatever, we'll look at the glass boats around us, which will be rocking around quite a bit more in this swell or with the wind conditions, and we're again quite stable because it's a 37,000 pound boat with a lead poured ballast in the keel, right? So it's very, very solid feeling, kind of like a barge. Look at this little muffin. She's so cute.
So muffiny.
You're so cute.
She's just so glad she got fed, and now she wants snuggles.
Yeah, you're a good girl. Cost of construction. Again, if this is probably more... Well, no, this is true of used boats too. The used boat market, you're liable to find, apples to apples again, for the same cost of boat, you're likely going to find a larger steel boat and a very well-equipped steel boat compared to the equivalent size glass boat, because there's a lot of concerns in the marketplace on the maintenance component of a steel boat, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. But the maintenance aspect is intimidating to a lot of people, and that will typically end up lowering the price of a steel boat in the marketplace. An older steel boat is going to show some signs of corrosion, which again is going to comparatively drop the price down a little bit. When you look at a glass boat, over time glass boats are going to last a lot longer, truthfully, right? If you build a glass boat and a steel boat in 1983, that glass boat, if it's well maintained, could look bloody well as new as the day it was made. That steel boat's going to have all kinds of you will see the obvious effects of scale on a sailboat on a steel boat, for example, if you've taken a ferry boat, you'll see how it's like looks like patches where the old corroded surface area of the steel will have been scraped off and filled and painted. And if it's done well, you won't really notice it that much. If it's been just patchwork, you'll see all the scale spots on a steel boat, right? So but again, it's cosmetic. It's not going to affect the strength or the performance of the boat in any kind of way.
Jesus. She's a little needy right now.
I think she's stuck here with this pillow. I think she's having a hard time dealing with this. So those are a number of reasons. Like, typically a steel boat won't last as long. So a 30-year-old steel boat in the market's going to be cheaper than a 30-year-old glass boat, mostly for those maintenance cosmetic reasons. And also because the build construction from new, it's gonna cost a lot more to build a mold for a glass boat, and then lay up a glass boat and so on and so forth. And for all those other reasons I alluded to before, you have to build a mold for the deck, and you have to create the furniture design, the insert design and all that stuff. So the upfront costs of building a glass boat are so much larger than the design costs and construction costs of a steel boat, where you can download a plan off the internet and go to a machine shop or a steel shop or whatever and have them CNC cut out all the plates and tack up and weld up a frame and then weld the plates on, and there you go. And anywhere where you can find a decent welder and a space to do it, you can build a steel boat. Repair and modification. So for the same reasons, repairs and modifications to steel can be done quite affordably anywhere in the world. In most places there's quite a bit of industry, even in the poorest countries in the world, there's going to be industry. You're going to have an easier time finding somebody who's a proficient welder. You'll find steel and welders anywhere in the world. You won't necessarily find glassing material, resins, and somebody who knows how to glass, if you don't, anywhere in the world. Again, the material costs. Steel isn't cheap. I'm not going to say it's cheap, but it's relatively inexpensive, whereas the fiberglasses and resins, due to availability and costs of oil any given day, can be very expensive. So those are some other aspects to consider if you're going to be cruising worldwide and trying to decide, should I buy a glass boat or a steel boat. Work can be done in a number of different environments. You can weld in pretty much any environment if you can throw a poly tarp around you somehow to get you out of the weather and so forth, whereas glass work is a lot more environmentally sensitive. You need to be in certain humidity, certain dryness, and so forth, and there's quite a bit more prep involved to do good glassing work. And the flip side of that is if you do shitty glassing work, it will be very shitty. It needs to be done right. You need to know what you're doing. What's very different about sailing on a steel boat that you'll notice right away is how stiff it is. And as it relates to rigging, you'll literally feel, and in some cases see, the rig and the boat flexing under high wind conditions, right? And it's not something you'll really see much on a heavily constructed steel boat, is like your leeward shrouds flapping, right? Whereas on a glass hulled boat, you will actually see in some instances that the rig and the boat itself is flexing so much that the leeward shrouds are just flapping, like literally loose. And under really, really high loads, you'll see that definitely you can have, some slack in your leeward shrouds. But on a steel boat, if I had my shrouds flapping like I've seen on glass boats, I would be like, oh my god. I'd be pointing it in the wind and dropping the sail. Yeah, so you will notice that if you're out for a sail on a glass boat, and say you're in rougher seas, and you come up through a wave and pound down on the next wave, you'll get a shuddering sensation in a glass boat, where it would actually be like, right? And with a steel boat, you don't get that shuddering sensation. It's something I clearly noticed the difference of in sailing this boat in rough seas, where we would come down and pound on the next wave, and the boat it'd make a big bang. It'd be like bong, right? Or we would hear the water shooting up through the bow thruster tube, so it'd make this like weird like puckering kind of noise, and I was like, what the hell is that? But the boat would come up, and it felt like I don't know, like a sword, right? It was just like boom, and it may make a racket or whatever, but the boat didn't shudder. And I remember all through my youth, especially like some of the crazy days where we sailed across Lake Ontario and coming up and smashing hard, pounding into the weather, and the whole boat would just be like wow, 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 right? And it was just the craziest shuddering sensation. You're like, is this thing gonna break apart? And things in like the glass boat, you'll hear them creaking and popping and that kind of stuff. And you know, I've even heard in some forums, I won't even name the brands, but I've heard of some people talking about particular brands where on anchor even they would hear the boats cracking and popping, and like, you know, the tabs, furniture lining within the boat being tabbed to the hull of stringers and stuff like that, cracking and popping and creaking and flexing and that kind of stuff, right? And that's one of the things I absolutely love about the steel boat, is that if anything's flexing or popping, you know, I'm calling Mayday, right? Like nothing flexes or pops on this friggin' boat, right? Like
one less thing you have to listen for while you're sleeping.
Yeah, exactly. Like I'll hear every manner of wind through every shroud vibrating through the hull, or every wave lapping up, because it's very conductive for sound.
It is.
But it doesn't flex, man. Like even in really nasty weather, the boat just slices through stuff, or it'll pound, but it's just like, you know, it just like hammers through like
a rock knot.
Like a rock, not like a piece of wood, or like so maybe like a 60-70 foot boat, you might start to get those physical properties, but on this size of boat, even compared to like 30-foot glass boats, like the glass boat would shudder, and this 42-foot boat's like solid as a rock. So the issue of corrosion with steel boats is the big issue in terms of deterrent for a lot of people who are considering buying a steel boat. Maintenance in a glass boat is considerably less onerous, you could suggest. The issue with glass boats, mostly discussed when you're talking about maintenance, is osmosis, where you'll get the little pockets of water that have via osmosis have made their way into the layers, the outermost layers of your fiberglass layup, and those little pockets need to be grinded out and filled back in with fiberglass, putty, and so forth. Or not putty, you wouldn't use putty. They're filled back in with resins and glass, and then you have to do a proper epoxy barrier coat, fair that, paint it, and so forth. So it's a pretty elaborate process, but once it's done again, it should last for a very long time. With steel boats, it's an ongoing maintenance regimen, year-round. You know, basically every year you're doing preventative maintenance on your boat. For example, like we've had this boat for a year. When we bought it, the bilge was basically recently painted and, you know, virtually rust free. A year on now, there are spots in the bilge where, mostly due to condensation, there's now rust that is bubbled up through the paints, which means the paint barrier has failed, which means throughout the bilge in certain areas I need to blast or grind away those paint areas, remove the rust convert those areas, and apply a new epoxy barrier coat to buy it more time. So Untreated, I think this is like a 0.1 of a millimeter or something like that, or a tenth of a millimeter or something like that. Untreated steel would, in a salt water environment under normal conditions, you lose that 0.1 of a mil per year. It's a very, very small amount. When you treat steel with a proper epoxy barrier coat, the steel will last indefinitely. But the problem is that condensation on the inside of the hull or any water that is sitting in your bilge will have the same effect as if the outside of your boat was untreated. So you're combating corrosion through your paint barrier on the outside of the boat and the inside of the boat. So a year in, I've got a number of spots that will need to be treated in the bilge of the boat, and the only reason I haven't been able to do that all winter long is that it's too wet. I can't get the bilge dry. I can't even put a dehumidifier and a heater down there because it's just going to create more condensation. So basically it's a matter of waiting for summer to come when we have it hot and dry again, because all summer long our bilge was bone dry. We had no issues with condensation down there, and no paint issues. But after a year of sitting, 7-8 months of moist and living in it and everything else, there are areas of the bilge that need to be treated, and same with the deck. So it's not bad, but basically every year I did one spot on one of the steps coming down from the back deck onto the sidewalk there, and that repairs after nearly a year now. There's a couple little spots coming up. So I mean, basically I anticipate every summer I'll probably have to go around and patch up those places, and then the next summer there will be new areas that I'll have to come up and go and touch them up, and by year 3 all the spots I did on year 1 will need to be retouched again, and so on and so forth. But again, if you're somebody who doesn't mind working with paints and epoxies and stuff, I love working with epoxies. I like having stuff to do. I'd rather do that than garden, honestly. I don't know, I hated gardening. When we had our house, I'm like picking weeds. I was so annoyed with picking weeds and cutting trees and going up and cutting branches and all that.
Nature's such a pain in the ass.
Painting the house, it's like, ugh. But I mean, sitting out on a boat surrounded by water, it's sunny, I've got a beer going, and I'm just sanding and painting and fairing and painting it up, and it's all nice and looks good when you're done. I love it, man. I don't mind doing this. It gives me something to do, and honestly, it's not that big of a deal. Like I said, that paint repair I did a year ago, I did it half-assed too. I just wanted to try a product out and see if I could quickly do it, and it's like most of it, 95% of the repair I did still looks great, and the one spot that was particularly bad that I didn't properly fill with like a putty or something like that, that's the problem spot. So now that I've worked on that spot, I know, okay, next time I go to a problem spot, grind it down properly, use an epoxy fill that's a good quality epoxy, sand that, fair it, prime it, and paint it with what we're using right now as an enamel paint by Interlux, which has a nice high hardness to it, and it's a nice white, bright white, and kind of glossy, which is slippery, but anyway, it looks really good, and it's not that expensive, so I can get a really good result from that so far. Environmental. So the last thing we wanted to talk about are, if you're concerned about the environmental aspects of buying a vessel, the benefits of a fiberglass boat are that it's going to last a considerably long time, a very relatively long time, maybe forever if you took care of it well, whereas the steel boat's going to have a shorter lifespan. But at the end of a steel boat's lifespan, it can be scrapped, melted down, and recycled 100%. At the end of a glass boat's lifespan, it's crushed and it's basically useless. Once you've laminated glass with resins, it's not reusable. It's a waste product, and it's a petrol waste. So I haven't seen any properly done comparisons, like of a footprint, analysis of, carbon footprint of building a glass boat versus building a steel boat. But I'm gonna go out on a limb here and suggest that the footprint of building a glass boat would be significantly larger than building a steel boat, just because it is ultimately a petrochemical material, and you know, you have to mine steel and everything else. So, you know, I don't care to get into a big debate about the environment when it comes to sailing. Most of these things are going to last a long time, probably a couple lifetimes, and it's really negligible when you think of it in those terms. But
The best thing you can do for the environment is just take good care of your boat.
yeah, keep your boat
Right?
well
Keep your
maintained.
boat alive for
Yeah.
a long time.
Yeah.